Eveleigh Loco Foundry, Redfern, Sydney. 11 December 1986. Four men in steel-cap boots stand outside the gates in the rain. Vince Russo, John Nelson, Roland Vassallo, Dick Nichols. They tell the Sydney Morning Herald the State Rail Authority is deliberately running down foundry work to manufacture closure justification. They are right. 2 years later, the gates close. This is the place where Australia built itself. 5,000 workers at peak, 102 years of locomotives. Tens of thousands of men, women and youths walked through these gates between 1887 and 1989. Joe Cahill apprenticed here before he was Premier. Ben Chifley fired engines out of these workshops before he was Prime Minister. Over 100 women stood at the lathes during World War II, the first time in 54 years women had worked the Eveleigh floor. 30 Pacific locomotives rolled out these gates between 1943 and 1949, including 3830, the last steam locomotive ever built in New South Wales. How did Australia close the factory that built itself? If you grew up watching 3830 pull into Sydney Central, hit subscribe. Every subscriber keeps these stories alive and these workers remembered. Chapter 1. The Yorkshire engineer who built Australia's railways. The man who chose the ground was English, born Falby, Yorkshire, 21st of December 1819. Son of a land agent. Apprenticed at 16 under his cousin William Billington. Trained on the Manchester and Leeds Railway under John Hackshaw. Worked the East Lincolnshire under John Fowler, the engineer who later built the London Underground. His name was John Whitton. Here's the thing about Whitton. He wasn't a colonial dreamer. He wasn't an imperial adventurer. He was a Yorkshire railwayman who had built lines across the English Midlands and married his boss's sister, Elizabeth Fowler, 25th of July, 1856, Ecclesfield Parish Church. 2 months later, he sailed to the other side of the world on the Royal Charter. He arrived in Sydney on the 14th of December, 1856. He was 36 years old. What did he find? 23 miles of track, 4 locomotives, 12 carriages, 40 trucks. The entire colony of New South Wales had less railway than a single English county. He was paid £1,500 a year, a fortune, and he was given a mandate from the Board of Trade to build a national network from scratch. Over the next 34 years, John Whitton supervised the laying of 2,171 miles of track. He pushed lines through the Blue Mountains using the Lapstone zigzag and the Lithgow zigzag, the first time in railway history that locomotives climbed a mountain range without rack and pinion. He drove the main south to Albury, the main north to Wollongara, the main west to Bourke. He turned a colony of 4 locomotives into the largest railway system in Australia. He was, by every account that survives, a man of granite. Henry Parkes, the father of Federation himself, said this about him: "A man of such rigid and unswerving integrity, of such vast grasp, that it would be difficult to replace him." Whitton refused political pressure his entire career. He clashed with 3 premiers and 4 treasurers. He never lost an argument that mattered. In the 1870s, looking at his growing network, Whitton conceived the Central Engineering Complex that would build, repair and run every locomotive in New South Wales. He chose the ground himself, the Chisholm Estate at Redfern. He resumed it in 1878. The compensation was £100,000 for 64 acres of swampy industrial land between Redfern, Darlington and McDonaldtown. He retired on the 31st of May 1890 on a £675 pension. He died of heart failure at Mittakong on the 20th of February 1898, aged 78. Estate, £10,396, buried at St Thomas's, North Sydney, 2,500 kilometres from where he was born. He drew the lines, he chose the ground, but he didn't live to see what was about to be built on it. Chapter 2. the largest workshop south of the equator. Site clearance began in 1882. The detailed engineering was executed by George Cowdery, the New South Wales Railways engineer for existing lines, the man who had built the Picton tunnels and supervised the Lithgow zigzag. Cowdery worked under Witten's overall direction, but the buildings are his. The contractor for bays 1 through 4 was a Sydney builder named George Fishburn. The locomotive workshops officially opened in 1887. The original site was 26 hectares, 64 acres. By the end of the First World War, the complex had grown to 51 hectares. 15 erecting bays, a foundry, a blacksmith shop, a pattern shop, a wheel press shop, a paint shop, the oldest hydraulic system in Australia, installed in 1886 and still operational a century later, and the triple-domed engine running sheds, 3 segmental arched bays, each covering 7 roads, with no intervening columns. Colonial budget hawks called them extravagant. By 1908, more than 3,000 men walked through the Eveleigh gates every dawn. The whistle blew at 6:30. Sydney's inner west moved to its rhythm. That same year, 1908, the new locomotive shop, commissioned in 1907, started rolling out its first Eveleigh-built engines. Over the next 2 production phases, this factory built 181 new locomotives from scratch. The New South Wales C32 class, the C36, the D50 Freight 28L. Australian designed, Australian built, hauling Australian wheat, coal, timber and migrants from one end of the colony to the other. The surrounding suburbs, Skinnerville, McDonaldtown, Redfern, Darlington, Chippendale, had been subdivided in the 1870s and 80s expressly to house Eveleigh men. Tight terraces, 2 up, 2 down, brick chimneys, outdoor dunnies, a tin roof and a 6-foot fence. Thousands of cottages. The men walked to work, so did their sons. By 1916, Eveleigh employed 5,000 workers. Here's the kicker. The men who built the railways that opened up Australia, the men who forged the steel, who riveted the boilers, who turned the crankshafts on the largest industrial floor south of the equator, those men were watching their wages stagnate while the cost of bread doubled in 3 years of war. They were watching their bosses introduce American time and motion management. And they were getting angry. By August 1917, Eveleigh was about to ignite the largest strike in Australian history. Chapter 3. The Card and the Cards. In November 1916, Acting Chief Railway Commissioner James Fraser walked onto the Eveleigh shop floor and addressed the men. He told them about a new card-based costing system, Taylorist scientific management, time and motion control, every minute of every shift logged on a card. The men knew exactly what it was. 21 strikes had already hit Eveleigh. Between 1915 and 1917, over wartime wage stagnation. They had read about Frederick Taylor's American Mills. They knew what the cards meant. The Cooperator, the railway union newspaper, wrote in July 1916 that scientific management was designed to take from his work the last vestige of individuality and to make him a mere cog in the machinery of production. That was an exact quote from the Union Press, 18 months before the strike. The cards were introduced at Randwick Tramway Workshops on the 20th of July 1917, then pushed at Eveleigh. The strike began on the 2nd of August 1917. 5,790 workers walked out on day 1, 3,000 from Eveleigh, 1,100 from Randwick, the rest from across New South Wales Government Railways depots. Within 1 week, 10,000. Within 2 weeks, 30,000. At peak, 77,350 workers in New South Wales alone, nearly 100,000 nationwide, including the coal miners, the wharfies, the gas workers, the carters. Premier William Holman was at the Premier's conference. Acting Premier George Fuller stood up on the 3rd of August and declared the strike a rebellion against the orderly government of the community. He demanded every Australian decide whether he is for the state or for the surrender of all authority to men who, for the time being, have lost all sense of public duty. That was a Liberal nationalist Premier saying that. The Labor Party had split over conscription 9 months earlier. The men on strike had no government to defend them. Joseph Cahill, fitter and turner, 26 years old, 10 years on the Eveleigh floor, was dismissed on the 14th of August, 1917. His employee personal history card, archived today at New South State Archives as Record Series 12922, is stamped in red ink with one word: agitator. Strikebreaker schoolboys from Newington College and Sydney Grammar camped at the Sydney Cricket Ground. The locals nicknamed it the Scabs Camping Ground. Sydney Cricket Ground. Taronga Zoo. Dawes Point. Loyalist farmers were trucked in from the Riverina. The Farmers and Settlers Association ran the recruitment. A carter named Mervyn Flanagan never made it home from Camperdown after an encounter with a strikebreaker named Reginald Wern. Wern was acquitted. The acquittal lit the fuse for everything that came after. The strike officially ended on the 8th of September, 1917. 6 weeks. 2,000 workers refused re-engagement. 22 trade unions deregistered. Eddie Ward, a young Eveleigh worker who refused the reinstatement conditions, later said he conducted a one-man strike for 7 years. He became federal MP for East Sydney in 1932 and held the seat until his death in 1963. Ben Chifley, the Bathurst engine driver who led his men out on the 6th of August, came back to find himself demoted from driver to fireman, firing the boiler for men who had scabbed on the strike. 28 years later, he was Prime Minister. The men who walked out came back with their seniority gone, their pride broken, and their sons watching. And then the Second War came, and Eveleigh became a weapons factory. Chapter 4. The Country in Every Locomotive. The first build phase ended in 1925, 181 locomotives complete. Eveleigh shifted to maintenance, repair and overhaul. By 1937, the volume was so heavy that the New South Wales government opened a relief workshop at Chullera to take some of the load. The carriage workshops on the north side kept building. The Silver City Comet rolled out in 1937, the first air-conditioned passenger train ever built in Australia. Royal carriages for visiting governors. KAM sleeping cars for the Sydney-Brisbane overnight. The rolling stock that connected this country to itself. Grain to ports, coal to harbours, troops to ships, school children to country schools. All of it on Eveleigh-built carriages, all of it pulled by Eveleigh overhauled engines. The Saturday closure had been won in 1892. The 6-day week was the foundation. The Amalgamated Engineering Union, later AMWU, the Amalgamated Metalworkers Union, became dominant on the floor through the 1920s and 30s. Premier Jack Lang's 1925 Reinstatement Act finally restored seniority to the 1917 strikers. By 1930, Lang was back as Premier and challenging the timekeeping system itself. Tens of thousands of men, women and youths walked through the Eveleigh gates between 1887 and 1989. The heritage wall on the precinct edge today carries that exact wording. Now here's the part the heritage plaques don't say. The foundry at Eveleigh was the worst job in Sydney. Cast iron rotor housings, open sand moulds, molten iron poured by hand at 1,400 degrees in corrugated iron sheds in Sydney summer heat. The men poured. They drank salt water from canvas bags. They went back to the line. The work took its toll. Burns from molten iron, long-term lung damage, silicosis from the foundry dust. Men rarely saw their 60th birthday. After the Second World War, the labour came from southern Europe. Greek pattern makers, Italian welders, Maltese fitters, Yugoslav assembly hands, Polish boiler makers, post-war refugees and assisted passage migrants who walked off the ships at Pyrmont and Port Melbourne and Station Pier in the late 40s and 50s, who passed through Bathurst and Bone migrant camps, and who ended up at Eveleigh because the foreman didn't ask too many questions about the English on a man's papers if he could read a micrometer. Alan Madden, Gadigal elder, recorded for the Eveleigh Stories Oral History Project, worked as a permanent casual for 7 years unloading trucks at Cornwallis Street, lived next door to the workshops. He told the interviewer this: "The Maltese, the Greeks, the Italians and the Kooris who lived in the same area did so without incident. That was Eveleigh. That was the Sydney Inner West those men built." By 1939, the world was at war again, and the largest engineering workshop in the Southern Hemisphere was about to stop building trains and start building shells. Chapter 5. The Shell Maker. In 1940, the New South Wales Government Railways stripped the railway machinery out of Bays 5 and 6. They built a mezzanine in Bay 5. They installed Department of Defence equipment in February 1941. The Boilermaker presses that had stamped out locomotive plates were now stamping shell casings. The numbers were brutal. By 1943, Eveleigh's munitions floor was running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. 2,700 shell castings a week at peak. Production ran on an emergency wartime quota system imposed by the Department of Munitions and enforced by the Manpower Directorate, the federal authority that could conscript any worker, male or female, into any factory the war effort required. Eveleigh became one of the most heavily man-powered industrial sites in the country. 25-pounder field gun shells, the standard British and Commonwealth artillery round of the war. The shell that armed the Australian gunners at Tobruk, El Alamein, the Owen Stanleys, Borneo. Eveleigh started production in early 1941 and didn't stop until 1945. That wasn't all. Components for the Sentinel cruiser tank, Australia's only locally designed, locally built tank of the war. The first 2 35-ton Sentinel prototypes ever built rolled out of Eveleigh in 1942. Jack Bruce, an Eveleigh worker recorded for the Eveleigh Stories Oral History Project, remembered them with one detail that made it into the transcripts. The prototypes had a 44-gallon drum of petrol strapped to the back while the engineers worked out fuel consumption. A 44-gallon drum of fuel on a tank. That's how Australia built tanks in 1942. Beaufort bomber fuselage components, subcontracted to Chullora and to the Department of Aircraft Production at Mascot. Components for Beaufort's anti-aircraft mountings. The Eveleigh, Chullora, Lithgow, Maribyrnong axis, the 4 nodes of Australia's wartime industrial spine. And here's the part the war histories don't always tell. Over 100 women employed at Eveleigh as process workers on the munitions floor. The first time in 54 years that women had stood at lathes inside the Eveleigh gates. The women came from Erskineville, Newtown, Redfern, Marrickville. Mothers, sisters, daughters of the men who had been called up. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Same wages as men on the same machines for the first and last time in Eveleigh's history. When peace came, every woman on the floor was let go. Industrial nurses introduced for the first time. Brian Dunnett, another oral history witness, said it like this: "The power of Eveleigh from an industrial point of view was immensely felt during the Second World War. This was an era that wasn't just producing trains." Prime Minister John Curtin praised the rail workshops in his wartime broadcasts. The forge fires never went out. When peace came, Eveleigh went back to building locomotives. It built the most famous Australian steam engine ever made, and then it built the last one. Chapter 6. 3830. Post-war build resumed in 1945. Chief Mechanical Engineer Harold Young designed the NSW 38 Class Pacific 462. Boiler pressure was 245 pounds per square inch, the highest of any Australian steam locomotive ever built. Tractive effort was 36,273 pounds. It produced around 2,500 horsepower. The C-38 wasn't just a locomotive, it was an Australian engineering statement. At a time when Britain was sending steam to its colonies as second-hand kit, Australia designed and built its own, from scratch, in Sydney, with steel from Port Kembla and copper from Mount Isa. 3801 hauled the Newcastle Flyer at 110 km per hour through Strathfield and Hornsby. 3820 pulled the Royal Train carrying Queen Elizabeth II on her 1954 tour. School children from Goulburn to Lithgow grew up watching these engines pass. 5 generations of NSW commuters knew their numbers by sight. 5 streamlined units, 3801 through 3805, were built by Clyde Engineering at Granville. 25 unstreamlined units were split between Cardiff Locomotive Workshops in Newcastle and Eveleigh. Cardiff built 12. Eveleigh built 13. 3801 entered service on the 22nd of January 1943 in wartime, grey nurse livery. Through the late 1940s, the Eveleigh line ran hot. 3806. 3808, 3810, 3812, 3814, 3816, 3818, 3820, 3822, 3824, 3826, 3828, and then 3830 entered service on the 27th of September 1949. The last steam locomotive ever built in New South Wales. A 92-year tradition ended in a single gate. 4 of the 30 survive. 3801, 3813, 3820, 3830. And on Heritage Days you can still watch 3830 roll onto Sydney Central main platform under steam. The brass nameplate reading the same number it carried out of the Eveleigh erecting bay 76 years ago. The first diesels arrived in the 1950s, the 43 class from American Locomotive Company. The 40 class, the 41 class from British Thomson Houston. Eveleigh's machinery was Victorian. The roof bays were too low. The foundry was too old. Diesel locomotive overhaul required different tooling, different sheds, different floor heights. The work moved to Chullora, then to Cardiff. The forge fires at Eveleigh kept burning for another 40 years. But the locomotives stopped. The men who had built 3830 in 1949 were still on the floor in the 1970s, doing diesel overhauls on machinery their fathers had installed. Their grandsons would never get the chance. Eveleigh's machinery had defeated the card system. It had defeated the Great Depression. It had defeated Adolf Hitler. It would not defeat a Liberal Premier from Hungary with a calculator. Chapter 7. The Calculator. 19th of March, 1988. Nick Greiner was sworn in as the 37th Premier of New South Wales. Hungarian-born, the family fled Budapest in 1947 when he was a few months old. Treasury Hawke, Liberal, 41 years old, the youngest Premier in New South Wales history at that moment. His own commercial biography is explicit about what came next. His government was a world leader in public sector reform, including privatisation, private infrastructure provision, contracting out, and financial management. a self-described world leader in contracting out. He commissioned the American consulting firm Booz Allen Hamilton, headquartered in McLean, Virginia, to review the State Rail Authority. The report was delivered in 1989. 8,000 SRA jobs to be cut. Withdrawal from 94 country railway stations. Closure of 3 regional branches, Ningan to Bourke, Queanbeyan to Cooma, Glen Innes to Wollongara. Axing of the Silver City Comet. Division of the SRA into business units. City Rail, CountryLink, Freight Rail, Rail Estate. The man who engineered the implementation was Greiner's Cabinet Office Director, Gary Sturges's. Sydney Morning Herald reporting credits. Sturgis with the dumping of 2,000 teachers, 5,000 school cleaners and more than 8,000 rail workers within the Greiner government's first year. Sturgis later went on to senior roles connected to Serco. Anthony Lowenstein has documented the trajectory. Now here's the part that should make every Australian furious. December 1986, 18 months before Greiner was even elected, 4 Eveleigh union delegates stood outside the Loco Foundry gates and told the Sydney Morning Herald the closure was already being engineered. Vince Russo, John Nelson, Roland Vassallo, Dick Nichols. They accused the State Rail Authority of deliberately running down foundry work to make workers idle to justify closure. They claimed the SRA planned to close the huge Eveleigh complex completely and shed 2,000 jobs on a section-by-section basis over 5 years in moves towards privatisation. Photograph by Antonin Kermak, 11 December 1986. Archived today at Getty Images. They were right about all of it. Sally. McManus, the woman who would become Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions in 2017, gave the Carriage Works centenary keynote on the 2nd of August 2017. She told the audience this: "My father started his apprenticeship as a cabinet maker here when he was 15 in the late 1950s. Cabinet makers were of course important to the building of carriages. Then came the 1980s, when neoliberalism in the form of Nick Greiner came on the scene, and the downsizing of the public sector started. Spill and fills were all the rage, and it was so stressful in our house as Dad, who had never done a job interview before, had to reapply for his own job many times over. This type of torture went on for years. In 1988, the Eveleigh locomotive workshops closed. In 1989, the Eveleigh carriage workshops closed, and the work went somewhere else. Newcastle, Maryborough, then Italy, then China." Chapter 8. Newcastle, Maryborough and the last Australian train. The main rail work moved to Enfield in 1988. Bays 5 through 15 of the locomotive workshops were leased to Paddy's Markets, while Haymarket was being redeveloped. The Tangara commissioning briefly continued at Eveleigh into 1988 before moving to Auburn. The forge fires went cold for the first time in 101 years. The contracts went north to Newcastle. Greiner and Company had been founded in 1899 by 2 Cornish brothers, Alfred and Ralph Greiner, at a small foundry in Newcastle. They moved to Broadmeadow in 1919. Through the 1980s, Greiner picked up the Tangara contract and a string of EMU orders. Through the late 1980s and into the 90s, Greiner at Broadmeadow was the place. They built the 4-tier Tangaras that replaced the silver-red Rattlers. They built XPLs, XPTs, the Endeavour. At peak, more than 1,500 men worked the Greiner floor. Newcastle had picked up what Sydney dropped for 1 decade, until the corporate structure went international. In 1999, Greiner was sold to United Group. In 2005, it rebranded as United Group Rail. In 2012, it became UGL Limited. In December 2016, Gimmick Group, formerly Leighton Holdings, now controlled by the German construction giant Hochtief, in turn owned by ACS Spain, completed a $524 million takeover of UGL. The Australian rail manufacturer that had kept Newcastle working for over a century was now owned through Frankfurt and Madrid. Walkers Limited had been founded by John Walker at Maryborough, Queensland in 1863, built Queensland's first locomotive, the Mary Ann, in 1873, built corvettes and frigates during the Second World War, sold to Evans Deakind Industries in 1980. Merged into Downer Edai in 2001. Today, the Maryborough plant is owned by Downer Rail and is still building trains in 2026. Queensland kept it open. Nemesaufbaus didn't. Queensland's Labor governments, Goss, Beattie, Bligh, Palaszczuk, Miles, protected Maryborough across 35 years. They funded apprenticeships. They tied state contracts to local content. In 2023, Premier Stephen Miles signed a $4.6 billion contract for 65 new Queensland trains, all to be built at a new state-owned facility at Torbanlia, 20 kilometres south of Maryborough. 3,000 jobs over 20 years. Public sector, Australian-built. The model Nissan threw away in 1988 is alive and running in Maryborough today. Clyde, Engineering Granville, Eveleigh's old C-38 partner, slowly closed through the late 1990s. We covered that story in another video. The last fully Australian-built passenger train fleet was the Millennium M-Set, built at Downer's Cardiff Locomotive Workshops in Newcastle between 1999 and 2002. Carr Labor government. Nemesaufbaus domestic build. Some reliability problems, but the trains are still running today. After Millennium, every train ordered for the Nemesaufbaus network has had a foreign country in its supply chain. And then in December 2006, the Nemesaufbaus government signed the largest rolling stock contract in Australian history, and the trains were built in China. Chapter 9. The Long Way from Changchun. December 2006. The Reliance Rail Consortium, Downer Edey and Hitachi in a public-private partnership, won the Waratha contract, 78 8-car A-sets, $3.6 billion, the largest rolling stock order in Australian history. Reliance Rail loaded itself with $2.4 billion of debt before the global financial crisis hit. In February 2012, the Nemesaufbaus government bailed out the project for $175 million. The body shells were built at CRRC Changchun Railway Vehicles in Jilin Province, China. Final assembly at Cardiff. Trains delivered between 2011 and 2014. In December 2016, the Nemesaufbaus government signed up for another 24 trains. The B-sets, or Sydney Growth Trains. $1.7 billion. Same arrangement. Downer CRRC Changchun body shells. In March 2020, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute released a report identifying KTK Group, a CRRC supplier, as using Uyghur slave labour from the Xinjiang region. CRRC was placed on the United States entity blacklist in July 2020. Premier Gladys Berejiklian stated in October 2020 that she was concerned. Senior transport for Nemesaufbaus executives, it turned out, had visited the CRRC Changchun plant in 2017 and 2018. On government-approved expenses. September 2014, the Sydney Metro Northwest contract. €280 million for 22 driverless metropolis trains, built by Alstom at Sri City, Andhra Pradesh, India, under the Make in India initiative. The first train arrived at Rouse Hill on the 26th of September 2017. Service commenced on the 26th of May 2019. August 2016. The new intercity fleet contract. The Rail Connect Consortium, Hyundai Rotem and UGL and Mitsubishi Electric Australia, $2.3 billion for 512 carriages, built by Hyundai Rotem at Changwon, South Korea. Then the Doors Too Narrow scandal. A confidential 2018 safety report withheld from the public until 2021. The Rail Tram Bus Union struck in November 2020 over driver-only operation safety concerns. 5-year delay. The first revenue service Mariyung train ran on the 3rd of December 2024, 5 years late, after sitting idle since 2019. And then Spain entered the chat. Chapter 10. Beasain, Sri City, Changwon. February 2019. The New South Wales government signed the Regional Rail RSET contract, $2.8 billion, 29 trains, 117 carriages, 15 years of maintenance. A new maintenance centre at Durban called Mindiara. The trains are built by Construcciones y Auxiliar de Ferrocarriles, CAF, in Beasain, in the Spanish Basque Country. The Civity platform. Bimodal, diesel and electric. The first bimode passenger rail in Australia. CAF, Construcciones y Auxiliar de Ferrocarriles, was founded in 1997 in the Basque foundry town of Beasain. It survived the Spanish Civil War. It survived Franco. It builds high-speed trains for Madrid, light rail for Houston, metro stock for Mexico City. Today it builds Australia's regional fleet from a factory at the foot of the Pyrenees, 10,500 kilometres from Dubbo, where the trains will be maintained. The trains were originally meant to enter service in 2023. The first 6-car unit arrived at Port Kembla on the 14th of February 2024. Revenue service is still pending in mid-2025. In October 2025, the NSW government dissolved the original public-private partnership contract, citing negotiations to resolve commercial challenges. The government now contracts directly with CAF and UGL. Then there's Western Sydney Airport, opening in 2027. The metro train sets for that line have been ordered from Siemens of Germany. Siemens Inspiro stock. So let's add it up. In 2026, every single passenger train operating on the NSW network is built, wholly or in major part, overseas. The Waratah suburban fleet, body shells from China, assembly in Cardiff. The Sydney Metro, built in India. The Mariyung Intercity fleet, built in South Korea. The Civity Regional fleet, built in Spain. The Western Sydney Airport Metropie stock, built in Germany. 5 flare flags, 0 Australian-built carriages. The total contract value across the 4 foreign-built fleets, Waratah, Metro, Mariyung, Civity, comes to over $12 billion of New South Wales taxpayer money. $12 billion spent in Changchun, Sri City, Changwon and Beasain. Not 1 cent of it was built in New South Wales. The last fully Australian-built passenger train fleet was the Millennium M-Set, commissioned at Cardiff, Newcastle in 2002. 24 years ago. There is one place left to go. The brick wall on the corner of Wilson Street and Cornwallis Street, Eveleigh. Chapter 11. Atlassian Central. Stand on the corner of Wilson Street and Cornwallis Street, Eveleigh, in late 2026. The orange brick wall of Bay 2 is still there. Same bricks, same shape, same dimensions as 1887, sandblasted, heritage listed, lit from above by a $1.4 billion tower called Atlassian Central. 39 stories, 183 metres, 75,000 square metres of office space. The world's tallest hybrid timber tower, designed by Shop Architects of New York and BVN of Sydney, built by Built and Obayashi joint venture, clad in 30,000 cubic metres of cross-laminated timber, much of it imported from Austria via Stora Enso. Underneath, Bay 1 and Bay 2 of the original 1887 locomotive workshops are preserved in situ as Eveleigh works. The Smithsonian Institution describes the surviving Victorian blacksmithing collection as the largest and most integral known anywhere in the Western world. A heritage wall on the precinct edge reads, "This wall commemorates the role that tens of thousands of men, women and youths employed at Eveleigh between 1887 and 1989 played in shaping industrial, political and cultural life in Australia." Across Wilson Street, the carriage workshops have become Carriage Works, an arts venue running the Sydney Contemporary Art Fair. The Commonwealth Bank Tower next door houses 10,000 employees. The Quantum Terminal 2 blocks away houses QQ Cottrell and Microsoft and Salesforce. Lesson 1. Manufacturing is a choice, not a market. Australia closed Eveleigh because Booz Allen Hamilton's American consultants told Nick Greiner's calculator that 8,000 rail jobs could be cut. The same year, 1988, Queensland kept Walker's Limited open. Walker's is still building trains at Maryborough today. The Queensland Labor government brought rail manufacturing back home in 2023 with a $4.6 billion contract. New South Wales chose to close. Queensland chose to keep. The market did not decide between them. Premiers did. Anybody who tells you that closing Eveleigh was inevitable is selling you a story written by Booz Allen Hamilton in McLean, Virginia. Lesson 2. The strikebreaker always comes back. In 1917, the strikebreakers were schoolboys from Newington College, and Sydney Grammar camped at the Sydney Cricket Ground. In 1988, the strikebreakers were management consultants from McLean, Virginia. In 2016, the strikebreakers were CIMIC executives in Frankfurt and Madrid. In 2017, the strikebreakers were Transport for New South Wales executives flying business class to inspect the CRRC Changchun plant. The names change, the tactic doesn't. Identify the firm that profited from the closure. Identify the firm that built the replacement. Then ask yourself what country those two firms are headquartered in. Lesson 3. Memory is built in steel, not in software. There is a heritage wall at Eveleigh today. It is the only memorial to the men who built this place. There is no memorial to the 2,000 workers blacklisted in 1917. There is no memorial to William Ainsworth, Walter Pidgeon or Joseph Cahill, the Eveleigh fitter who carried that agitator stamp through the rest of his life and became New South Wales Premier in 1952. There is no memorial to Vince Russo, John Nelson, Roland Vassallo or Dick Nichols. There is no memorial to Sally McManus's father, the apprentice cabinet maker who got spilled and filled out of his own job after 30 years. The bricks are preserved. The workers are forgotten. Industrial heritage is a choice about what we choose to remember. The orange brick wall of Bay 2 is still there in late 2026. Same bricks, same shape, same dimensions as 1887. Behind it, where the forge fires once burned at 1,400 degrees, the median Atlassian software engineer earns $250,000 a year, roughly 2.5 times what a Sydney boilermaker earns annually. The cross-laminated timber overhead is Austrian. The trains under the platforms next door are Chinese, Indian, Korean and Spanish. The wall is the same. The country isn't.